Hello friends, welcome to another video on the history of Jerusalem. Today, I would like to present to you a topic that is rarely mentioned. That is, who lived in Jerusalem before the Israeli conquest of the Promised Land. I will not only present you with a biblical perspective that you may know very well, but also look at the extra biblical sources that describe this area. In the last part of the video, we will compare biblical information with secular sources and try to synchronize them. I am sure some of the information will be new to you, and I hope you will find it interesting. But before we will begin, please don't forget to like this video, comment and subscribe to the channel. This helps me greatly in reaching new people on YouTube. So this small gesture is critical in expanding the channel. Of course, do that only if you like the content. Thank you also for great comments of encouragement you left in my last video on the city of David. If you have not seen that video, make sure to check it out. I am leaving a link in the description. With that out of the way, let's begin our investigation. I want to start from the extra biblical sources and see what they tell us about Jerusalem. Israel was really created in Egypt and not in the Promised Land. You remember the story, right? Jacob, who was called Israel by God, had 12 sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel. Actually, there were 13 tribes because, as you remember, Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were elevated to the status of full tribes by Jacob. So, in reality, there was no tribe of Joseph, because on his spot, the two sons he had jumped in. So, Egypt was an important country for Israel's history. And so, it is not a surprise that the first mention of Jerusalem comes from Egypt in the form of the exertion texts from the 20th to the 19th century BC, when Egypt ruled Canaan. What are the execration texts? Well, the execration texts were kind of dark magic that the Egyptians used in that time. They were also a way in which Egypt tried to keep its vassals loyal. How? Simple. The names of the cities and their rulers were inscribed on a clay balls or figurines of slaves with their hands tied behind their backs. If a vassal revolted, the Egyptian magicians would break the image of the rebel in the hope that this would break his spirit. So the figurines worked in a similar manner as the voodoo dolls. Since Egypt had a colony at that time in Canaan, names of Jerusalem rulers were found on the execration texts. The names found are Shashan and Yakram and date to the 20th century BC. It is not uncommon that many cities like Jerusalem were ruled by two leaders. Some see this as evidence that at that time there were several tribes, each with its own leader integrated within a particular city. The exact pronunciation of the Egyptian name of Jerusalem is not clear from the hieroglyphic, but it probably sounded like Rushalimum. The name resounds more clearly in the later Akkadian texts, which refer to the city as Urusulimu. The original Hebrew name was Jerusalem. It is assumed by scholars that the name of the city reflected the worship of the god Shalem. It was common to name cities after the local god, but the name might also mean the city of Shalem or founded by Shalem. Remember, I am presenting to you a secular perspective on Jerusalem. We will get to the biblical one later in the video. The execration texts are an important resource for researchers in the field of ancient Near Eastern history of the 20th to the 18th century BC and Bible studies. The first group of execration texts were published by Kurt Siffi in 1926, known as the Berlin Texts. Georges Poser published a second group of the texts in 1957, known as the Brussels Texts. The first collection of tablets not only mentions Jerusalem for the very first time, but also names of approximately 20 places in Canaan and Phoenicia and over 30 rulers of the period. The second group of texts are inscribed on figurines of bound prisoners discovered in Saqqara. This group contains the names of 64 places, usually listing 1 or 2 rulers. 7 known Asian countries are also listed. The second major source of information about Jerusalem that comes from the times before Israel's conquest also comes from Egypt, this time in the form of letters dating to the 14th century BC found in the archives of Amarna. As it usually is, the discovery was accidental. The farmers who were digging in the clay ground wanted to improve their soil. Suddenly, they started digging out a collection of tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform language. What was later presented is that the farmers found remains of an ancient city of Akhenaten, which was ruled by Pharaoh Akhenaten. Formerly, this pharaoh was known as Amenhotep IV. He was a famous pharaoh because he placed the sun god Aten at the top of the hierarchy of Egyptian religion. So, in this ancient city of Akhenaten, about 400 tablets were found. This is interesting because part of the letters turned out to be a correspondence between the major powers in the region, like Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, or Assyria. Among them were also letters that came from Canaan, who, at the time, was still a vassal of Egypt. The correspondence is very insightful because the local tribes in Canaan started to complain to Egypt that they are threatened by a nomadic tribes known as Habiru. The Egyptian vassals, in their letters to Egypt, plead for a military intervention of Egypt because those foreign tribes are distorting Egyptian interests in the region. One of the authors of the letter is a person named Abdi-Hed, who rules the Judean hills. Possibly, he was a ruler of Jerusalem in the 14th century BC. Archaeologists found 6 letters from this man, and in all of them, he was asking for the shipment of weapons and military aid to control the situation in the Judean hills. He expressed his great concern about this Habiru people who threaten his rule. One of the tablets, titled EA 287, says specifically that the Habiru people are attempting to take Jerusalem. So, what do we know from those 2 important sources? First, that in the 20th century BC, the city that sounded like Jerusalem or Salem existed and could be ruled by more than one leader. Second, that in the 14th century something started to change in the land and a foreign power in the form of the Habiru people started to attempt to conquer the Canaanite cities. If we look at the conservative chronology of events, the 20th century BC is the time of Abraham and Melchizedek. At that time, the place which we know is Jerusalem was called Salem, so similarly to the name presented in the execration texts. In the Bible we read that in Abraham times there were many tribal kings and the land would not be controlled by one national power. This is also reflected by the execration text that mentions 2 rulers of Rushalayim. In the 14th chapter of the first book of Moses, we read,
And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is, the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled.
Here we can see an example showing that in those days, those so-called small kings ruled small territories and the land of Canaan was very fragmented by local rulers. Please remember, Canaan is a small territory the size of New Jersey, and this small territory was very divided into local spheres of power. Some cities even had two rulers, which show that at that time the land of Canaan did not belong to a single group of people. There was no strong monarchy that would unite the people. On the opposite, the people were of different nationality and religions. So, the claim that the tribes of Israel were taking the land from another nationality is false. Not only the tribes did not create a monolith, but their place of influence changed. As seen in the passage from the 14th chapter of Genesis, there were also local wars between those tribes. If we follow the biblical text, later on we read that Abraham, who had his own private army, had to rescue his nephew Lot, who was taken captive by Chedorlaomer and the kings who allied with him. Abraham was able to defeat them. This shows that the armies of the local kings were not as we would expect. They were small hit units. That's why Abraham, who was not a king, could defeat the armies of several tribes. The second information about Jerusalem is even more interesting. The 14th century, by many conservative Bible scholars, is recognized as the exodus of Israel from Egypt and the beginning of the conquest of Canaan. This synchronizes with the information we found in the Amarna Letters. Could it be possible that the mentioned Habiru people are in fact the Hebrews that left Egypt and began their conquest of the Promised Land? Obviously, you could say that Habiru and Hebrew sound similar, and perhaps this is something to be considered. But you should also remember that the term Habiru is the term used in the 2nd millennium BC text throughout the Fertile Crescent for people variously described as rebels, outlaws, riders, merchants, bowmen, servants and slaves. So, it does not have to mean a specific tribe or nationality, but a type of people. Again, here the Hebrews would fit this description, and they could be called by Abdihed the Habiru people. Certainly, at this time, according to the conservative biblical chronology, the tribes of Israel were attempting to take the land, including Jerusalem. What do you think? Can the Amarna Letters refer to the Hebrews when they mention the Habiru? What else can we find in the Bible that refers to Jerusalem before it was conquered by Israel? Well, the accounts that describe the situation in Jerusalem are quite enigmatic. For example, we learned that during Joshua's conquest, Jerusalem was ruled by the Jebusite king called Adonizedek. Instantly, we can recognize that the name sounds similar to Melchizedek, who is mentioned as the king and the high priest in Salem some 6 centuries before. Are the two people related somehow? Or Zedek is just a title that was given to kings in those regions? What do you think? Of course, the person of Melchizedek is a very mysterious, and I made a special episode about this. If you did not see this episode, check it out. I think you may like it. I am putting a link in the description. Anyway, this King Adonizedek is not a good guy according to the biblical account. He establishes an alliance with several other kings such as Ohan, king of Hebron, Piream, king of Yarmut, Yapid, king of Laish, and Debir, king of Eglon. All those kings want to attack the city of Gibeon, which decided to join with Israel in their own alliance. Joshua, who is faithful to the treaty, does not leave Gibeon alone and moves his armies to rescue the attacked city. Joshua wins the confrontation with the Confederation of Armies and pushes them away from Gibeon in the direction of Beth Horon. Then, miracles start to happen. First, as the army of Adonizedek was escaping, God was throwing stones on them from sky. Additionally, we read that the sun was stopped at its position on the sky to give Joshua and his army more time to defeat the evil alliance. The army of Adonizedek eventually hide in the Makkedah cave, where they are found and killed by Joshua and his soldiers. However, we learn later in the biblical account that the victory over Adonizedek does not end the Jebusite rule over Jerusalem. In the 15th chapter of the book of Joshua, we read that the tribe of Judah was not able to drive the Jebusites out from Jebus. We read that because of this, the people of Judah lived with the Jebusites. In the book of Judges, we also read that the tribe of Benjamin was also not successful in conquering the city of Jebus. Then, however, in another passage, we read that the city of Jebus was conquered and burned. This is mysterious because we also know that David had to conquer the city again when he became the king of all Israel. And even David's conquest did not eliminate the Jebusites, because we read that David purchases the field of Araunah the Jebusite for the future temple. So, who lived in Jerusalem before the Jews and Muslims? The answer, both from the extra biblical texts and the Bible, is that the land of Canaan was very fragmented and there was no one nationality that would be dominant. You could argue that Egypt was the ruling power, but only in theory because the local tribes had much autonomy. Jerusalem was a known city even in the 20th century BC, internationally known. The tribes of Israel struggled to take over this particular city from the local tribe of the Jebusites for many centuries. Eventually, after the unification of the tribes of Israel by David, the Bible text tells us that Jebus was conquered. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the history of Jerusalem. Understanding the history gives us a better outlook on the current state of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, even today, Jerusalem is a battleground and one of the most contested places on the planet. The Bible is clear that this place belongs to God, who decided to give it to the Jewish people for an everlasting possession. So again, thank you for watching. And also, don't forget to subscribe and give a like to this video. Also, leave a comment. I would like to know what do you think about this issue. Lastly, I want to thank you all who decided to support the channel. Thanks to you, we can keep on going and produce more videos like this, which takes much time and sometimes many resources. Your support helps me in a great way. So far we have 86 people who support the channel by joining the channel and about 16 through the Patreon page. Remember, any donation, even the smallest one, is very appreciated. Have a great day and see you soon.